Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into the past, but not the part with kings and castles. We're skipping the feasts in great halls and ignoring the silver platters. We're heading to the streets, to the alleys, to the fire-lit corners where food was fast, greasy, strange, and sometimes downright dangerous. That's right. This is medieval junk food. Not served on royal tables, but slung from carts, sold by torchlight, shoved into hands still dirty from work, salty, oily, burned, or barely cooked. This was the food that fed the hungry, the drunk, the desperate, and the broke. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't fancy, and it wasn't always legal, but it was everywhere. And while we think of fast food as something modern, the truth is, medieval peasants, merchants, and even nobles had their guilty pleasures. Street pies with mystery meat, fried rats on skewers, pigeons stuffed with who knows what, deep-fried batter, greasy bread, spoiled wine, and things we're still not sure were technically food at all. So, if you love this kind of calm, curious history, served with a side of oddity and the occasional shudder, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. And if you're still listening by the end, drop a comment and tell me, what's the weirdest snack you've ever eaten? Now dim the lights, get cozy, maybe grab a midnight snack. Just make sure it's not centuries old. Let's begin. Pies filled with mystery meat. Literally. If you were walking through a medieval town at dusk, wet cobbles, smoke curling through alleyways, the murmur of deals and dice and drunk laughter, you'd smell it before you saw it. Pies, savoury, hot, greasy, sold from carts, carried on trays, stacked on wooden boards. Street pies were everywhere, and for a hungry traveller or a worker with one coin to his name, it was the fastest way to fill your stomach. But what was in them? That's the thing. You didn't ask, because half the time, no one knew. They were called rissoles in some places, coffins in others, stuffed with ground meat, herbs, sometimes cheese, sometimes not. Wrapped in thick, dry crusts, not meant to be eaten, but simply to hold the filling in place, medieval Tupperware if you like. And the meat could be pork, could be pigeon, could be a bit of yesterday's rabbit, could be rat. Not always by accident. The butchers didn't waste, the cooks didn't question. Meat was meat if it fit in the crust and didn't stink too badly when warmed over the fire. The spices, pepper, clove, garlic, onion, were strong not to flavour it, but to hide what it actually was. These pies were sold fast. No reheating, no wrapping. A hot lump of crust in your hand, filling in your mouth, and a silent agreement between buyer and seller. Don't ask, don't tell. They weren't nutritious, they weren't clean, they weren't cheap either, but they were warm, and in winter, that was enough. A jester once joked that a man could die 3 ways in a medieval city, by sword, by pox, or by pie, and nobody laughed, because every peasant had taken that gamble at least once. Fried rat on a stick, not a myth. No, this one isn't folklore, and no, it wasn't always a last resort. In certain corners of medieval Europe, especially during lean winters or plague seasons, rats weren't just pests. They were dinner, and not hidden away in some boiling stew pot either. They were skewered, roasted, sometimes even fried, right there in public, sizzling over coals beside sausages and poultry legs. It sounds horrific to modern ears, but the truth was simpler. Protein was scarce and rats were plentiful. In cities where the poor packed shoulder to shoulder and famine knocked at the door every other year, a plump sewer rat meant survival. Vendors knew this, and so, with a straight face, they'd sell meat skewers to passers-by. You paid your coin. You didn't ask what kind. And if it tasted vaguely of chicken and didn't bite back, you called it good enough. Now, not every rat was taken straight from the sewer. In some places, people raised clean rats, caught young, fattened on grain, then skewered and grilled like any game. The skin crackled, The smell was rich, greasy, peppery, charred. Sometimes it was brushed with cheap vinegar to cut the oil. Other times sprinkled with dried herbs. Thyme, maybe. Mustard seed if the cellar was fancy. And no, this wasn't a delicacy, but it wasn't shameful either. You ate it walking or squatting on a stone near the fire. You shared it sometimes, tearing the crisp meat from the bone and handing the other half to a child with blackened fingers. One chronicler wrote that in a certain street in London, the scent of roasting rat was as common as roses in spring. Maybe that was a joke, but maybe not. Because when you're hungry, dignity isn't the first thing on your mind. Food is food, and if it's hot, crispy, and costs less than a loaf of bread, you don't ask where it came from. You just eat. Ale boiled sausages, the drunkard's delight. Imagine this. You've just worked 16 hours on a frozen field. Your hands are cracked. Your feet haven't been dry in 3 weeks. You've got one coin. Just one. And there, by the tavern fire, is the smell of something sharp and rich and wrong in all the right ways. Sausages, boiled in old ale, browned in their own grease, hung on iron hooks and rotated over the flames by a man with too many scars and not enough patience. You stumble closer. He grunts. You hand over your coin. He doesn't ask what you want, because there's only one option. The ale sausage. In modern terms, it would fail every health inspection. The meat, a mystery. The casing, probably gut. The seasoning, overpowering. Black pepper, clove, garlic, onion, even a splash of vinegar to cut through the rot. But the real trick was the ale. Not the kind you drink on a feast day. Not fresh, not fancy. This ale had gone. Sharp, sour, closer to vinegar than beer. Perfect for soaking meat that had spent a little too long out of the sun. The sausage would be boiled in it, then seared on a flat pan of scorched iron. It hissed. It popped. It left a smell that clung to your tunic for days. You ate it from a scrap of bark or a square of rough cloth. No utensils, no pause. It burned your fingers and numbed your mouth. And it filled you up. That was the genius. The combination of a hot grease, strong booze, and a peppery salt gave the illusion of richness. Gave the body what it craved after days of turnips and black bread. It also made you sleepy, or dizzy, or bold enough to challenge a knight to dice. And that's why in the darker corners of every medieval market or tavern yard, the sausage man always had customers. Always. Because if you didn't mind the mystery, and you needed warmth, fat, and forgetfulness in one bite, there was nothing faster, nothing greasier, nothing more medieval than ale-boiled sausage. The infamous blood pancakes of the winter market. They were cheap, they were hot, and they were, by every modern standard, deeply disturbing. In winter, when meat was scarce and grain even scarcer, clever cooks found a way to stretch scraps and offal into something that could be sold by the cartload and eaten on the run. They called them blood pancakes. Made from congealed animal blood, usually pig or ox, mixed with flour, onions, bits of fat, and sometimes a single egg if luck allowed, these flat dark patties were fried on wide soot-blackened pans over open flames. The smell? Sharp, metallic, comforting in a strange way. It was a smell that said, something rich is cooking, something you can afford. You'd get one wrapped in old cloth or sometimes just handed on a flat piece of bark. You'd bite in, and it was dense, chewy, and strangely satisfying. A salty hit of iron and grease, often swallowed with ale, watered wine, or if you had no coin left, a mouthful of snow. Blood pancakes weren't just fast food, they were survival food, because butchers wasted nothing. After the cuts were sold to the wealthy, what remained was scraped, boiled, drained, fried, repurposed. The blood was caught, cooled and folded into dough-like batter, then crisped to a charred edge over flame. Vendors sold them near abbey gates at winter markets, even just outside graveyards after funerals. The irony of that location was not lost on the fool, who sometimes sang, "A bite of the beast to forget the buried." They were fast, they were filling, they were for the poor, and yes, they were controversial even back then. Some clerics warned against eating blood, others said it was unclean, but the people didn't care, because when your ribs showed and your stomach growled louder than the bell at Vespers, you didn't ask for scripture, you asked for heat and blood. Boiled and fried in oil was the fastest way to warmth a medieval street could offer. Burnt cheese on bread, the original melted mistake. It was never supposed to be a dish. It started as an accident, a crust of bread too close to the fire, a lump of cheese forgotten on top. A night too long, too cold, too drunk to care. And yet, somehow, it worked. Burnt cheese on bread became one of the strangest, simplest medieval snacks. Fast, greasy, wildly inconsistent, and wildly popular. The ingredients were basic. A hardened loaf, often days old, rock-like and sour, cut into thick slabs, topped with whatever cheese hadn't gone mouldy, or sometimes because it had. The cheese might be goat, cow, or even made from old sheep's milk. Sharp, salty, sometimes bitter. The key? You burned it. Not just toasted, blackened, over hot coals on a flat stone or suspended on a thin metal tray too close to the hearth. The cheese bubbled, then blistered, then crisped into a lacy edge of salt and smoke, and the bread beneath. It softened just enough to bite through without shattering a tooth. Vendors sold them in the evening, outside taverns near smithies, even by church steps after services. The scent drew crowds. Sharp dairy, toasted grain, the unmistakable edge of carbon, and people loved it. It filled the mouth, it filled the belly, and it stuck to teeth, to fingers, to the memory of a night that would otherwise blur into smoke and frost. Some added onion, some scraped garlic across the bread first. Some drizzled rendered fat from earlier meals to keep the whole thing from going dry. It was ugly, uneven, greasy beyond reason. But it was hot, and fast, and you didn't need utensils or even two hands. One to hold it, one to drink. The fool said once, "If you can't make your bread soft, make your teeth harder." And for many peasants, that burnt cheese crust was the only hot food they'd get that day. In a world of porridge and turnips, it was practically indulgent. And yes, it tasted amazing. If you ignored where the cheese came from, if you ignored how long it had aged, if you ignored the flavour of ash. But that's the nature of medieval junk food. You didn't dine, you devoured. The mead-soaked apple, street dessert or sticky scam. Among the soot and salt and grease of the medieval street market, there was one thing that smelled sweet. Apples, but not the crisp orchard kind. These were shriveled, soft, and barely hanging onto their shape. Sold from hanging baskets, roasted over flame, or, more famously, soaked in mead until they became something halfway between dessert and drunken mistake. They called them honey apples or tavern fruit. Cheap, fast, and often served still warm, these sticky spheres were the closest thing a peasant might get to candy. The idea was simple. Take a tired apple, bruised, tough, or sour, and soak it in spiced mead or ale for a few hours, sometimes overnight. The alcohol softened the skin, dulled the tartness, and gave it a flavour somewhere between fermented and festive. Then it was roasted, on a stick, over flame, turned until blistered, bubbling, and just starting to collapse. Sometimes dusted with old spices, nutmeg if the vendor was rich, cinnamon if they were showing off, or simply a pinch of salt and a smear of old honey. The result? Soft, boozy, sweetish, and more filling than it looked. You bit into it carefully. Too early, and it burned your lips. Too late, and it fell off the stick and onto the mud. There was no middle ground. They were sold at feast days, outside churchyards, at the back of taverns where children loitered while their parents argued over beer. Some vendors even claimed theirs could heal sore throats, warm the belly, or stir up love if eaten on the right moon. But most knew the truth. It was the cheapest thing you could make look festive. A soft fruit, a splash of old drink, a fire, and the power of scent. And if the apple was too sour, just add more mead. Did it count as dessert? Only if you didn't mind it dripping down your sleeves. Still, in a time when sugar was more expensive than silver, a mead apple was a festival in your hand. Sticky, strange, slightly suspect, but sweet enough to make the day feel less grey. Deep-fried dough blobs, the original street fair disaster. They didn't have a name, not a proper one anyway. Some called them grease cakes, others sizzle lumps. One town just called them those things. But whatever the name, every medieval market had them. A bowl of wet dough, a vat of spitting fat, a woman with scorched fingers and the sharpest eyes in the street. And a line. Always a line. These weren't delicate pastries. They weren't planned. They were made from leftover flour, a splash of sour ale, and whatever scrap of fat could be rendered into something hot enough to sizzle. The dough was sticky and wet, barely held its shape. But once it hit the bubbling cauldron of tallow or lard, it puffed, curled, darkened into something golden. Or black, depending on luck. There was no uniformity, no recipe, no safety. Just scoop, drop, burn, flip, hand over, and people loved them. Because for a few copper coins, you got something hot. Crisp on the outside, wet and chewy on the inside, sometimes hollow, sometimes dense, always unpredictable. Some vendors added things, dried herbs, bits of old onion, grated cheese if they were generous, or a pinch of dried apple or date if they wanted to call it sweet. Mostly, though, it was just dough and grease, but that was enough. You ate them fast, they didn't keep. Within minutes they turned heavy and cold like regret, but eaten fresh, just seconds from the oil, with steam still leaking from the cracks. They were perfect. Perfect in the way only poor food can be. Dangerous, dirty, comforting. Kids begged for them. Drunks relied on them. Bakers hated them because they weren't bread. They were rebellion. Food made from scraps, made fast, and made for those who didn't care if it was healthy as long as it was hot. If you bit in too fast, it burned your tongue. If you waited too long, it turned to stone. But for that one golden minute, it was heaven. Greasy, wobbly, finger-burning heaven. Fermented fish paste, the dip that should have stayed buried. It didn't look like food. It barely smelled like food. But in medieval port towns and coastal villages, one pot lurked in the shadows of every street market stall, bubbling, black and thick as a curse. Fermented fish paste. Today we might call it a condiment. Back then, it was more like a dare. The Romans had garum, the Norse had rackfisk, and in the medieval world, this pungent sludge of salted rotting fish was the street cook's best kept weapon. They made it from scraps, the heads, the bones, the guts, thrown into a pot with heavy salt and left, literally, to rot, for weeks, sometimes buried in the ground, sometimes sealed in clay jars stacked near the outhouse. When it was ready, it didn't smell like fish. It smelled like survival. And they didn't eat it plain, of course. They used it as a topping, a glaze, a drizzle, a soup base. Anything to give bland barley cakes or stale bread the illusion of richness. Vendors near docks would smear it on flatbread and fold it, hot and sour, into a pouch for travellers in a hurry. Others dropped a dollop into boiling broth for sea flavour. Some would dip fried rat in it, or pigeon, or nothing at all. It was the kind of thing you only tried once on purpose. And then, if you lived, You either craved it forever or swore it off until death. The fool joked that it could raise the dead, or at least clear a tavern. But it wasn't just a gag. It was calories. It was salt. It was protein in its strangest, most aggressive form. And for those too poor for real meat or cheese, a single smear of fermented fish paste could turn a crust of bread into a meal. It lingered in your beard, your breath, your memories, and somehow people kept coming back. Because when the wind was howling and you couldn't feel your toes, there was something comforting in a bite of hot bread, slick with the taste of something sharp, ancient and undeniably alive. Sort of. The salted pigeon surprise. Game bird or gamble. It wasn't rare, it wasn't luxury, and it definitely wasn't fresh. The salted pigeon was one of the cheapest meats you could get on the street, and also one of the sketchiest. In towns and cities where game was taxed and livestock expensive, pigeons filled the void. Literally. They filled courtyards, rooftops, market stalls, and eventually, your plate. But by the time they reached the pan, these weren't plump birds just plucked from a dovecote. They were dried, cured, heavily salted, and often mysterious. Vendors would hang them by the feet, featherless and shriveled over smoking braziers. The meat inside, tough, stringy, chewy in ways meat probably shouldn't be, but it was coated in layers of rendered fat and crisp skin that crackled just enough to distract your teeth from the texture underneath. Sometimes they were stuffed. A handful of bread mush, maybe some dried onions. Sometimes nothing at all but bones and hope. You ate it on the go. Picked clean while standing near the fire. Tossed bones into the gutter. Wiped your hands on your tunic, or not at all. And the surprise part, that varied. You might find the heart still inside, or eggs, or a sliver of bone that hadn't quite crisped and now lived in your molars. In rare cases it wasn't pigeon at all, but crow, or magpie, or something smaller. The fool once said, "If it flies and dies, it fries." No one questioned it. Salted pigeon was fast, hot, affordable. It didn't fill you up, but it gave you something to chew on, something to remind your body that meat still existed, even if only barely. And if you chased it with ale and followed it with a nap, you might just forget what you ate, at least until it came back to remind you later. Blackened onion cakes, ash, grease and glory. They weren't elegant, they weren't balanced, they were charred, ugly and absolutely beloved. Blackened onion cakes were the kind of medieval junk food that never made it into noble cookbooks, but always found their way into the hands of anyone too hungry to care. The recipe, if you could call it that, flour, water, salt and an onion. Chopped coarse and angry, the batter was slapped onto a pan, griddle, or even a hot stone already slick with yesterday's grease. Sometimes it sizzled, sometimes it hissed, and more often than not, it burned. Which was the point. The edges crisped black, the onions turned sweet and sharp, the whole thing smelled like fire and sweat and something vaguely delicious. You folded it in half, held it with a cloth, and ate it before it cooled into a disc of regret. Street vendors made them fast, dozens at a time. No two looked the same. No two tasted the same. Some were thick and doughy. Others fell apart in your hands. Some were more onion than cake. A few were just grease and pride, and yet, somehow, they worked. The heat, the chew, the hit of salt and onion. It was everything your body needed after a long morning hauling carts or a cold night watching sheep. The vendors didn't advertise them. They didn't need to. The smell did the work, curling out of alleyways, pulling workers off the road and drunkards off benches. You followed your nose and found lunch. The fool claimed you could tell a town's soul by the colour of its onion cakes. The darker, the better. Because these cakes weren't cooked with care. They were cooked with fire. the kind you stoked with scrap wood, the kind that crackled too high, the kind that smoked out your eyes but fed your gut. And in the end, that's what junk food is, isn't it? Not perfect, not polite, just fast, hot, greasy, real. The medieval version of a bad decision that tastes just right. Boiled bread slop, when porridge pretended to be a meal. You knew it by its sound before you saw it. A thick slop as it hit the bowl. A wet thud like something landing that shouldn't have. This was boiled bread slop, also called trencher mash or pot mush. It was born of desperation, and served with enthusiasm by street vendors who knew that hunger didn't come with taste buds. Here's how it worked. You take stale bread, not yesterday's bread, last week's, hard as stone. You soak it in hot water, or ale if you were lucky, then mash it with whatever you had. Onions, fat drippings, bits of garlic. A bone boiled until it begged for mercy. The result? A greyish, gluey paste poured into a wooden bowl, or, more likely, straight into a split hunk of bread functioning as both dish and disaster. Some vendors added a dash of vinegar. Others stirred in dried herbs. Some even went wild and dropped in a single poached egg, which immediately disappeared into the mass like a ship sinking into a swamp. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't even solid. But it was warm. It filled your belly. And it stayed there. You could eat it fast with your hands or a crude spoon. It didn't require teeth. It didn't demand manners. It was fuel. Hot, heavy, and forgettable. The fool called it liquid regret, but even he ate it on the coldest days. Mothers gave it to children. Workers ate it in silence. Vendors offered it cheap, served with a wink and a shrug. Sometimes it smelled faintly of meat. Sometimes it just smelled like old beer and onions. And yet, for all its misery, it had one job. And it did it well. You didn't crave it. You didn't remember it. But for a few minutes, you didn't feel empty. In a world where meals were a maybe, boiled bread slop was a certainty. Hot, thick, and just disgusting enough to keep you alive. Battered eel bites, slimy, greasy, and weirdly popular. You'd smell them before you saw them, a mix of scorched oil, river mud, and something unmistakably fishy. Battered eel bites were the late-night snack of choice for peasants who didn't ask questions, and townsfolk drunk enough not to care. Eel was everywhere in the medieval world. Rivers were full of them, slippery, wriggling, hard to catch, but free. And free was the magic word when the market ran dry and your purse echoed with emptiness. Normally, eel was smoked, stewed, or baked in pies, but on the street, they fried it, cut into chunks, coated in flour or ground oats, or sometimes just old breadcrumbs scraped from yesterday's stall, then dunked in hot fat and sizzled until the outside crisped and the inside turned to something halfway between fish and jelly. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't pretty, but it was hot and fast. The battered eel bite was handed to you on a splinter of wood or bark. No sauce, no salt unless you asked. You just bit in, felt the crunch, and then the slippery slide of the meat beneath. Some pieces were bonier than others. Some had skin, some didn't. Some still moved a little from the heat. You never knew what you were getting. That was part of the gamble. They were popular near rivers, of course, but also outside taverns and churchyards. Fishermen sold them. Bakers fried them. Some taverns even offered them spiced, which usually meant someone waved pepper in their direction once last week. And somehow they had fans. The fool called them mud sausages. Others called them guilt snacks, because no one admitted to liking them, but everyone ate them. They were cheap, they were salty, they were strange, and in the right moment, when your hands were numb and your stomach was hollow, they were perfect. Because medieval fast food wasn't about pleasure, it was about filling the gap between hunger and shame. And battered eel bites did just that, with extra grease. Candied fennel seeds, the sweet that broke your teeth. Not all junk food in the Middle Ages was salty, greasy, or shaped like something you'd rather not name. Some of it, a rare few things, were meant to be sweet, or at least pretend to be. Candied fennel seeds were one such treat, tiny, crunchy, disarming, and if you bit down too hard, they could leave a mark that outlasted the flavour. They were made for moments of indulgence. Street vendors sold them near churches on feast days, or slipped them to children who hadn't smiled in a week. But make no mistake, this wasn't candy as we know it. There was no soft caramel, no melt-in-your-mouth chocolate. This was sugar armour over seeds that tasted like black licorice and firewood. To make them, vendors would take fennel or anise seeds and coat them slowly in a boiled mixture of honey or cheap sugar syrup, if sugar could even be found. The syrup hardened into a crunchy glaze, forming little rough orbs of sweetness. If done right, they sparkled. If done wrong, they stuck together in a brick that had to be chipped apart with a knife. Peasants sucked on them during Mass. Some chewed them after garlic-heavy meals to freshen breath. Others, children especially, just liked the crunch. But they came with hazards. The sugar coating was sharp, jagged. If you weren't careful, it scraped your gums or cracked your molars. And some batches had sand or tiny stones stuck inside, carried in from the dirt floor kitchens where they were made. Still, people bought them because real sugar was rare, sweetness was a luxury, and in a world of onions, porridge and stewed roots, even 5 seconds of flavour was worth it. The fool called them tooth taxes. Monks called them divine distractions. Children just called them the best thing ever. They were fast, portable, and just dangerous enough to feel forbidden. Perfect, in other words. Boiled pigskin, the original chewy snack. It didn't look like much, just a slab of something greyish, damp, shiny. But to the hungry and especially to the poor, boiled pigskin was a delicacy of pure utility. A medieval snack that walked the line between food and challenge. It started with scraps. After the pork was butchered, the lard scraped and the meat claimed by the rich, what remained was the skin. Tough, rubbery, useless to most, but not to street vendors. They knew the secret. Boil it, long, with onions, herbs, vinegar if you had it, and enough salt to sting. After hours of bubbling, the skin softened into something chewable. Not tender, not quite flavourful, but edible, just some sold it cold, some hot, some sliced it into strips like ribbons of regret. Others served it whole, a slab folded over itself, dripping with broth and grease. You ate it slowly. You had to. Your jaw did the work. Your teeth made peace with the fact they were now tools, not ornaments. And it filled you. The fat within the skin gave warmth. The salt revived your energy. The sheer chewing of it convinced your body something important was happening. Vendors offered a splash of ale to wash it down. For extra coin, of course. A brave few added mustard. One man, according to legend, served his with fermented milk. He died poor but remembered. The fool said it best. If you can chew pigskin long enough, you forget you're starving. It wasn't meant to taste good. It was meant to last. A snack that doubled as exercise. And to the traveller with 1 coin in hand and another 10 miles to walk, it was the perfect junk food. Tough, salty, strangely satisfying, and better than an empty belly. Spoiled wine soup. When nothing goes to waste. If you've ever wondered just how far a medieval cook would go to avoid wasting anything, this was it. Spoiled wine soup. A bubbling pot of second chances. Fermented, foul, and somehow still sold. It began with wine. Cheap stuff, barely passable when fresh, stored in clay jugs or leather skins. Once it turned, you didn't toss it. You cooked with it. Street vendors and alewives figured out that sour wine, even when it bordered on vinegar, could become a kind of soup. Add stale bread, onions, garlic, bits of dried herbs, a ladle of broth if you had it, and salt, lots of salt. The wine boiled until it lost its bite, or most of it. What remained was sharp, thin, tangy, something between a stew and a punch in the mouth. Served steaming from battered iron pots, the soup was ladled into wooden cups, small bowls, or even hollowed out crusts of old bread, called trenchers. You drank it quick, you didn't ask what was floating in it, and you didn't stop to smell it, because if you did, you might change your mind. But somehow it worked. The acidity cut through the day's dullness, the warmth filled your chest, the old bread at the bottom soaked it all up, becoming a sour sponge of something vaguely edible. Some vendors claimed it cleared the lungs. Others swore it sharpened the senses. One fool said it gave you dreams rich men pay gold to avoid. But for a few copper coins, it gave you warmth. That's what mattered. In the depths of winter, on feast days too poor for real feasts, spoiled wine soup became tradition. It was a joke, a dare, a comfort, a warning, and a reminder that medieval junk food didn't care how it started, only that it ended hot, even if it made your tongue curl. Bone marrow toasts, the poor man's butter. This one had class roots, but by the late hours of a market day, it had trickled down the food chain into something fast, greasy, and borderline addictive. Bone marrow toasts. Picture this. A line of charred bones, cracked lengthwise, roasted over fire until the inside turned molten. Vendors scooped out the glistening marrow with a knife or a stick, if they were in a hurry, and smeared it onto rough-cut bread already singed from the edge of the coals. That's it. No spices, no garnish, just hot fat on stale crust. And it was delicious. Marrow was the medieval answer to butter, rich, slippery, and full of the kind of warmth your body begged for during cold nights. And unlike meat, which was taxed, measured, and expensive, marrow was often overlooked, discarded, or sold cheap by butchers after the good cuts were gone. So the smart vendors got there first. They bought the bones, split them open, threw them on coals, and turned the inside into gold. Peasants loved it. So did merchants too broke to afford full meals. Even tired guards bought marrow toast to chase the cold from their teeth. The fool said it best. You may die poor, but your lips can still taste like royalty. Sometimes it came plain. Sometimes, if you were lucky, a vendor rubbed a bit of garlic on the crust or added onion ash for flavour. But really the marrow did the work. Warm, fatty, unapologetically greasy. It didn't travel well. It didn't keep. You ate it now while it dripped down your thumb and onto your sleeve. And when it was gone, you licked the bread, then licked your fingers. Because in a world where food was mostly bland, dry and functional, bone marrow toast was one of the few things that actually felt like a treat, even if it came from a bone no one else wanted. Lard cakes, grease, grain, and guilt. It sounds sweet. It wasn't. There was no sugar, no fruit, and definitely no cake. Lard cakes were the ultimate peasant fast food, built not for flavour but for fuel. You started with flour, barely sifted, often coarse, added water, maybe a pinch of salt if you were feeling fancy, and then lard. Thick, soft pig fat, scraped from the bottom of a butcher's bucket, rendered over fire until liquid, then spooned into the dough by hand until your knuckles shone. The batter was flattened, patted into rounds, and slapped onto hot stones or blackened pans. They sizzled, they smoked, they curled at the edges like burned parchment. And when they were done, they shone, golden, crisp, shatteringly greasy. Served hot, folded in half, eaten on the walk from stall to ditch. One in the hand, another in your coat. Vendors wrapped them in old cloth if you were lucky, or just dropped them into your palm, still dripping. They tasted like salt, smoke, and sin. Not sinful in the sweet sense, Sinful in the "I can't believe I'm eating this again" sense. But they worked. They gave you energy. They stuck to your ribs. They reminded your body it wasn't dead yet. And in winter, that was all you needed. Lard cakes were peasant multi-tools, eaten as breakfast, split with broth for lunch, chewed slowly in silence by the fire. They didn't crumble, they didn't spoil, and they didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. The fool once held one aloft like it was holy bread and said, "This is what God gave the hungry and the hungover," and no one disagreed. They were poor food, fast food, the kind that made your hands shine and your lips sting, and for a moment, just a moment, they made you feel full, even if your conscience tried to argue otherwise. So, still hungry? Maybe not, because medieval junk food wasn't designed to tempt. It wasn't crafted by chefs or served with flair. It was born in fire and mud, in alleyways and markets, in hands that had too little time and even less coin. It was survival food. It was comfort food. And sometimes it was just food. But it tells us something important. Fast food isn't new. Cravings aren't modern. And the need to fill your belly quickly with whatever's available, cheap and hot, has been with us for centuries. So next time you pass a drive-thru or unwrap a foil-wrap snack in the dark, just know a medieval peasant might have done the same, with a scorched onion cake, a fried rat, a toasted smear of marrow on week-old bread. Maybe they didn't have sugar, or fries, or soda, but they had cravings. They had hustle. They had their own kind of grease-stained satisfaction. And now, you know the truth. If this weird little stroll through culinary history gave you a grin or a grimace, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want more quiet, strange corners of the past served with a side of smoke and salt. And tell me in the comments, what's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten? Because trust me, someone in the 1300s probably beat you to it. Until next time, rest well, eat bravely, and remember, even the worst meals make the best stories. Sleep tight, and don't let the fried rats bite.